Okay, so let's start talking about drill bits here and which one we're going to use. Now, starting with your run-of-the-mill drill bit, this has a very wide angle, which makes it very hard to start in a very accurate manner in our blank here. And again, this has to be dead on. So that one's not going to work for us. Moving on, what we could use is something like this. Now, this does have a pilot point on it, and it works great in metal. It also works great in wood. Again, it's a little bit too broad, though, for what we need. We need something with a little bit finer point. So we could use a brad point like this. Now, this has a very sharp point to it. It'll find our center hole and should be able to bore its way down in there without any problem. However, what I've decided to use is just your regular old Forstner bit. Again, we've got a very sharp point. It's going to cut a very clean hole. These brad points, they tend to tear out as they go in. They drill a very straight and accurate hole. However, due to the spiraling, I mean, they're almost like an auger bit. They really force their way in, and they have a lot of tear out. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and chuck this up into the drill press, and we're going to drill out our hole using a 3/8 Forstner bit. So now that we're ready to drill, what I've done is I've put my Forstner bit as high up into this chuck as I can possibly get it. I've also raised the table as high as I can get. These two together will eliminate any play, hopefully, that I'll get out of this. The shorter the shank that's sticking out, and also the shorter that the quill has to travel, will hopefully reduce any amount of error that we're going to get from this. So with that set, we're ready to go ahead and drill. Now I'm just using a rotary tool, and what I want to do is just make a couple little nicks in here, and that's so obviously when we drive it in, the glue will have a little bit something extra to bite onto. Now I definitely don't want to knock the corners off, because the corners are what's going to help this thing drive in center. So we don't want to round them over, we just want to make a few notches. Also, I'm only notching it on the upper half. So this bottom piece, of course, is going to go in first, and that's really going to make sure that it's centered and drives in straight. And then all the bite will be on this top half. One other thing I want to point out, when I drilled the hole, I went about probably 1/8 to 3/16 deeper than what I needed to. And that's so that when we turn it, we can go and true up the bottom, and obviously we're not going to hit the metal when we do that. So I'm just going to insert a little bolt here, and that'll allow me to then drive the coupling nut a little bit further down on in there. Now, in case you're wondering, I didn't put any glue on there as I was tapping it in, at least not yet. What I did was took another piece of 1/4" rod and threaded it in there, and I'm going to use that as a gauge to make sure that I'm exactly square. Now, one thing you need to kind of look out for is inherently there's some play in this, just in the mesh of the threads. So you kind of have to take that into account and kind of compensate for it. But using a square, you want to go all the way around it. And the more times you can go around at the different angles, the better reading you're going to get. So when you're satisfied that it is square, you're ready to glue it in. On the first one I used epoxy. This being such a tight fit and also having the points biting on it, I think I'm just going to go ahead and try a little bit of CA on this one. We'll see what happens. So with the CA cured, we're ready to start cutting out our star shape. Now, as always, there's a lot of different methods that you could use to cut this out. The most logical choice would probably be to take it to the bandsaw. The bandsaw will give us a nice straight cut that we can stop, back it out, and then come in from another direction and then cut out our wedges. Problem with the bandsaw is you have blade flex as well as the rough cut left by the alternating teeth of the bandsaw blade. So anytime I'm given the option, I try and figure out another way of doing it. Now, I like the blade on the table saw. One, it's carbide. Two, it has the rigidity that we need to give us a nice straight cut. And also, it's spinning at a very high RPM, which gives us a pretty clean cut. Problem is, this is obviously no ordinary shape, and cutting it on a table saw can be a little tricky. So what I had to do was build a special little jig to help me cut this out. Let's head over there now, and I'll show you what it looks like. So this is it. A simple piece of plywood with a bolt and 2 curve cuts. Now this one I mounted onto my crosscut sled. I like it simply because there's absolutely no play in my sled, and I know that I'm going to get a nice straight cut. You could use your stock miter gauge. Again, most of the time there's a little bit of play in here, but you know, if you want to add some set screws or do something to take that slop out, it'd be a perfectly acceptable alternative. Now the way this works is we're using a 1/4 inch bolt coming through, and of course our threaded insert is there, so all we have to do is screw it on there, make a cut with the blade raised to a specific height, back it off, rotate it, make another cut. If we do this in exact order, we'll wind up with our star shape. Let's head back over to the bench and I'll show you how to lay out this piece of plywood. Okay, so I've got a piece of plywood here. It's about 10 inches long, and the width is pretty much the same as our blank. It could be bigger, but you definitely don't want to go smaller on this. Now, I've got one line drawn here, and it doesn't really matter where you put this initial line, but I would recommend that you put it to where there is still some material sticking out on the opposite side here. That way the piece is supported. So with that line drawn, we're going to refer back to our number that we wrote down earlier, the 21/64. And if you recall, that was from this line to the exact center before we drilled this out. Very important number. What we have to do is lay that out from the center point, just like we did earlier, lining up our number 1 here kind of as a little T-square, and mark it out on both sides. And then we're just going to use our adjustable square and a very sharp pencil and mark those lines off. And what you want to do is go ahead and mark an X on the outside of either line. Very important. Next step is to mark our location for the hole that we're going to bore that the bolt is going to go through to hold this on. So what we want to do is measure from the outside, and it doesn't really matter where we start, but we just want to measure from the outside of our disc to roughly the center. Doesn't have to be exact, not yet. Okay, that's to the center point. But we actually want to be on the pencil lines here, not on our original mark, but actually on our pencil lines. So from that, there's about a 3/8 to a half, depending on which side you go to. We're going to subtract that distance on our square. Come back over here and mark on our center line that location. Take it over the drill press using a 1/4 inch bit, and again a brad point or a Forstner bit, because we want to hit that spot exactly perfect. We're going to drill it out, and then we'll move over to the table saw and start cutting. Now the only other thing that I really need to do is transfer those lines, the 2 outside lines, up to the top. We'll need those in just a minute for reference. So we've got our bolt, we're going to insert it through. Now we're ready to take it over the table saw, and I'll show you how to set this up to make accurate cuts. So with the plywood clamped in place, what we want to do is line it up to where the outermost tooth will just barely skim this line. Again, we've got our X's here. We want this to be the curved side. We just want to barely take out that line. Split it if you can. This is an alternating tooth blade, so you want to rotate it until you find the tooth that's facing the most towards the line that you're going to cut. One thing that's very important, don't worry about this side here, your left. Worry about the way you're looking on your right side right now. This is the one that we have to concentrate on. This one will come later. So get this one lined up, and let me put the camera on the opposite side, and I'll show you how that we line up our blank in preparation to cut it.